Before I will start with chapter 10 about Umineko our confession, I first want to clarify some things regarding the whole notion of Ryukishi deceiving his readers, because this aspect is fundamentally misunderstood. So I will try to explain it using an analogy. Essentially, my position comes down to the following thing. Umineko is better understood as a computer game than a regular novel. In a computer game, the player isn't passive but takes part in the story itself. In Umineko, the player isn't completely passive either, but is actually acknowledged within the story itself. I call this the fifth perspective theory, which I will explain in the final chapter. In some computer games there are different endings, and depending on how you play the game, you will receive a different ending. And sometimes you have to beat the game on the hardest difficulty to get to the true ending. In Umineko this isn't expressed in the sense of endings, but in the sense of quote-unquote layers of truth, if you will. Umineko consists of Beatrice's three stories. The first story, or the lowest layer, is the magical explanation. Everything was done by a witch. The second story, or second layer, is the quote-unquote official explanation, or the chicanentries explanation. And the third story, or the third layer, is the hidden truth. And just like in many computer games, you need to defeat a final boss in order to truly finish the game with the real ending. So if the readers are in fact players, and Ryukishi does often call the readers like that, who are they playing against? Well, basically you are fighting against the author himself. Remember that Umineko for the most part already consists of seeing through deception. Everyone who doesn't believe that it was all done by magic already agrees with that, as most scenes don't take actually place the way they are depicted. So just like the reader is acknowledged as a player in the game, Ryukishi, the author, is also present in the game, and as I said before, I basically believe that Ikiku can be seen as his game piece or representation. In other words, Ryukishi himself is the final boss of the game, and in order for the player to reach the third layer, he needs to defeat the final boss. Now what is the weapon that this final boss is using? His weapon is essentially deception. And to be precise, it's the second layer of the game that is his weapon, the official explanation. And most players will not be able to get beyond the second layer. And in a sense that is fine, as most people are generally happy with the official explanation, as it is a way of understanding the story. Not a truly consistent one, which a lot of them in fact admit, but it essentially doesn't need to be consistent, as it is in the end not truly about a mystery game, but about a girl confessing her love to a boy in a very convoluted and awkward way. It's her message that is important, and the murder mystery is just a medium for that story. The problem is that many people hear words like lying and deception and think of it in a malicious way, but that's a complete misunderstanding, and I hope this illustration of layers will get you to see that. So when Ryukishi is talking in interviews, he isn't maliciously trolling you or anything. He is talking about the second layer of the story. It is a lie and a deception in the sense of it not being the real truth, but the second layer is a quote-unquote truth of some sort. Essentially, it's the golden truth of the majority of players, with Ryukishi's words basically as real-life purple declarations, which to them are like red truths because they don't regard them as a quote-unquote culprit. However, as I have been arguing for, there is the third layer where the real truth can be found. But in order to get to that point, one needs to defeat the final boss. In other words, defeat the official explanation and see the real truth behind that. And this layer, this third story, as I said in our confession, is meant for the 1 in 1,000 and a story that you need to find on your own. However, Ryukishi has provided us with the tools to defeat him. Just like in a video game, there are power-ups and weapons scattered all throughout the game, which in and of itself would make no sense since it puts the enemy in an incredible disadvantage. However, they are there because you are meant to be able to complete the game. In fact, it is designed that way. In the same way, Ryukishi has provided us with the tools for getting to the third layer, namely the red truths, the detective's authority, will solutions, and the on-purpose inner conflicts that can be found in the official explanation. In other words, in order to reach the third layer, one needs to take the rules and the tools of Umineko and judge the official explanation by it. And when you do, you find that there are many conflicting red statements, conflicting circumstantial evidence, self-contradictions, and problems concerning the coherency of the official explanation. And here's where the irony comes in, because there is one final hurdle. After you broke through the defenses of the final boss, so to say, you can come to two conclusions. Ryukishi screwed up and there is no third layer, or the second layer was in fact a purposeful deception to protect this third layer. And what is the irony here? You can only reach the third layer if you actually trust Ryukishi. Trust that he knew what he was doing. Trust that he made a coherent story. Trust that if you take his rules and the tools he gave you, you can find a coherent and explanatory solution to the story. Many critics dismiss my theory out of hand, saying that there is no sense to Umineko if you can't trust the author. But the irony is that I do trust the author. I trust that he's not incompetent, I trust that he didn't screw up the internal consistency of his story, and I do trust the very rules that he gave the story. There are in fact many chicanetrist believers who agree with me that the official explanation is full of holes. But ironically, they are the ones who do not trust Ryukishi, as they think he simply messed up. But I do trust him. After all, one of the meanings of "without love it cannot be seen" has to do with the trust between the witch's side and the human side, in which the love refers to trusting the rules and keeping the rules. Basically to have a fair fight. So I do hope that this illustration of layers will help you better understand the main premise of this video series and the purpose of Umineko Our Confession, which I will talk about now in chapter 10. One last thing I want to say is that the final 3 chapters are perhaps a little less satisfying than the previous chapter, for the reason that we now will be delving in a lot of matters that cannot really be proven in the first place. And my explanation of Our Confession of course hinges on my theory in general being correct. That's why I saved it until the end, after having made the case for my theory. So let's now move on to chapter 10. Since Umineko Our Confession has not yet been translated, I cannot read it in full, but I will comment on the summary of it. I don't see Our Confession as an actual revelation of the truth for obvious reasons. After all, there are no red statements made in it. Also, even though there are connections to other games, like a 6-link closed room scenario and a family conference in which Kinzo appears, it is not a revelation of the actual tricks behind the story, at least not for the most part. Instead, I see it more as a guide on how to think, but also a guide on how not to think. In other words, it's a test for you to see what you are able to see through. Let me read the summary to you. Quote, Beato is going over the plan for her latest game board with Glenner. It's still a work in progress. She explains that turning the plan into a proper story is the hardest part, and making the surface plot work with the hidden plot is harder than actually working out the tricks. She's always writing 2 stories at the same time, a fantasy and a mystery, but she only reveals half of it. It's like cooking only a small part of a cow and throwing out the rest. I already want to comment on this part, as I see the Beatrice here not really as a representation of the actual Beatrice, but more in the sense of it being a representation of Toya Hachio. At least that seems very likely to me. Okay, continuing. Glenner calls it extravagant but also regrettable. She says that if people saw the discarded portion, they might be impressed with the taste and the bold cuts. But without that, most wouldn't be as discerning as Beato would like. Although Beato claims that she writes for only 1 in 1,000 people, she actually wishes that the other 999 people would enjoy it too. It's foolish to deny herself that by burying her own story in darkness. Another comment here. I think that a hint towards the official explanation being a deception actually can be found in this part. Okay, continuing. Beato says it's alright if her story has a strange taste to it that only 1 in 1,000 can enjoy, since it's written by a witch. Glenner counters that her job is to use the 10 Commandments to make such stories understandable to everyone. Beato agrees, which is why she doesn't really want to hand the story over to her. Glenner says she understands. Beato isn't looking for everyone to understand her, but she does want at least one person to. Delanor wants to help that happen by releasing Beato's incomplete stories someday, including the parts that would normally be discarded. Perhaps you can take this part as a hint that Ryukishi is not aiming on creating a story that everyone will understand, but only that certain people will understand. Continuing, she compares Beato to a girl in love who wants someone to understand her heart, but talks about it with difficult words, waiting for a single prince. Beato agrees, saying that witches can also want someone to understand their hearts. Delanor says that if that prince doesn't appear for Beato, she'll lead the way with the Nox commandments. And if that doesn't work, she'll release the incomplete story, which will become a key to Beato's world. Beato says that would be like a girl being too embarrassed to confess in person and making her friends do it for her. But Delanor replies that love can come into being that way too. Beato caves in and agrees to give her the manuscript. However, she seals it in a bottle to be opened only in case of her death. People who reach the truth via the bottle story won't be able to talk to her about it, but the prince she's waiting for is one who doesn't need a bottle. No one can love a cat after tearing its guts out, and the bottle story is her guts. Delanor agrees to her terms and wishes her luck. Beato says that even if someone managed to reach her, the witches in the sea of fragments are cruel and might just spit them back out. Delanor tells her that if she writes stories that only people with love can see, she ought to have some love for those girls too. Without love, she might not be able to see her own prince. Delanor asks her not to forget the many witches who have love and bids her farewell. Renouvet leads her out. The next part is Delanor's foreword. As a result of Lady Beatrice's death, I am releasing this incomplete tale in accordance with her will. In reading this work, I was reminded of her long years of sadness and couldn't hold back my tears, but at the same time I felt pity for her. Although she was searching for someone who had love, I am sad to say that ironically her heart was filled with anger at those who did not. She once told me that it was fine if her story reached only one person in 1,000. However, that was wrong. Out of those 1,000 people, she wished her story would reach even one more person. If you asked her, she would surely laugh and deny it, but those were without question her true feelings. In the beginning I was uncertain about releasing this manuscript. I thought that I should hide it, so as to preserve her mystery for the 1 in 1,000 savior she spoke so often about. But as I read and reread it, I began to realize that the manuscript was a message with no destination address. So when reading this, I can't help to think that it might be the case that Ryukishi is basically saying here that he wishes for someone to find out the real truth that is obscured behind the official explanation. In other words, that he's talking about one of the few people who will be able to see through that deception. Continuing, it was a wish that even she never realized she had. But now I understand it, and I think it should be granted. That is the reason I decided to release this incomplete manuscript. After you read this, it doesn't matter whether your feelings towards the woman named Beatrice are love or anger. But if you can, try to reach her feelings, buried in the deepest part of the story. She said that she wrote 2 stories and revealed 1. However, that was also wrong. She wrote 3 stories and revealed 1. By reading this incomplete manuscript, you will know 2 of those stories. I would like you to reach the 3rd and final one with your own power. Okay, this is very interesting to me, because in a sense, Ryukishi did in fact write 3 stories to Umineko. Namely, you have Umineko viewed from the magical perspective, so that everything is done by an actual witch. Then you have the deception of the official explanation. And then the 3rd one would be the hidden truth that is obscured by the official explanation. The first one would be accessible to absolutely everyone, because that is the magical perspective, that basically what we are shown as the viewer. And it is stated here that by reading this manuscript, namely Umineko Our Confession, you will know the 2nd one of those stories. And then it said, I would like you to reach the 3rd and final one with your own power. So in other words, a surface reading of Umineko will give you the explanation that a witch was behind it. And this manuscript will lead you into believing the deception of the official explanation. And then there is the 3rd story that he hopes that you will reach, which will be the real truth that is hidden behind that. So could that be what Ryukishi is actually trying to say in this part? Continuing, as another woman, I strongly wish that of those reading this work. Without love, it can't be seen. They are her words, but I shall repeat them. Love exists in everyone's hearts. Her true tragedy was that she couldn't see it. My deepest thanks go out to everyone who helped with the compilation of this book, especially my assistant and then a name that I cannot read because it's in Japanese kanji. Signed, Delanor A. Knox. The next part is titled Accomplices. Beto decides to make Kraus and Natsui accomplices this time. Since Natsui is so prideful, it's unlikely that she would cooperate with a frightening incident like this just in exchange for money. It'll be necessary to corner her and take away any option to resist. Beto decides to have Peace Beatrice wait until the storm hits, then secretly leads Kraus and Natsui to the gold room and threatens them by revealing the time bomb device. With contact to the outside world already cut off, they'll have to agree to cooperate or everyone will die, not just the sacrifices. Okay, for the rest of the summary I will simply read the entire thing and comment on it afterwards. Continuing, after dark on October 4th, Peace Beatrice used a sawed-off shotgun to force Kraus and Natsui to accompany her to the underground passage entrance. Since Kraus was a child, he has believed there were hidden tunnels under the island that only Kinzo knew about, but he didn't know it for sure until just now. She starts telling them about the explosives. Beto explains that Kraus knows all about Kinzo's madness, so he wouldn't doubt that such a device could exist. However, she has to have Peace Beatrice demonstrate her understanding of the bomb and its explosive power. Natsui doubts that Kinzo would create a device like that under his own home. Kraus says he heard several times that the island used to be a naval base, and that there was a huge amount of explosives stored there. He also heard Kinzo say that the island would disappear without a trace the moment his luck ran out, or something to that effect. Beto says that Peace Beatrice's explanation might not be convincing enough, so she'll have Genji corroborate it. Genji confirms that Kinzo did have a time bomb device and that it's now under the control of Beatrice, the new family head. Natsui is shocked to think that during all the years they lived on the island, one of Kinzo's whims, or even a coincidence, could have caused the explosives to go off. Kraus expresses doubts as to whether the explosives still work after such a long time, so Peace Beatrice explains that she tested them to make sure, and they were unexpectedly powerful. The bomb would blow away at least a several 100-meter radius surrounding the mansion. Genji reminds them of the disappearance of the shrine last year. Kraus and Natsui remember the servants talking about a purple lightning bolt at the time, but such a thing couldn't possibly exist. Besides, even the crack that the shrine was on vanished, and that couldn't be the result of lightning or a wave. Peace Beatrice says she performed the test to celebrate her revival, but wasn't expected such total destruction. Kraus realizes that Peace Beatrice must want their cooperation with something, since she went to the trouble of showing them all this and clearly doesn't need money. She agrees and says it'll be a trade. In exchange for his and Natsui's cooperation, she'll give them the entire mountain of gold and guarantee the lives of their family. But everything else on the island will be destroyed by the bomb. Beto says that they'll probably lose their composure for a while, but there's no room to refuse. Kraus will point out that there won't be time to move the gold, so it will be destroyed by the blast. In response, Peace Beatrice will give him a bank card to access 10 billion yen that she had already converted from gold. Kraus will probably find it hard to believe that the money really exists, but since his family's lives are in danger, he's not really in a position to refuse. Kraus will also have other reasons to go along with it. The blast will probably be treated as an accident, so he can monopolize the inheritance. Kinzo's death will also be covered up, and he can collect the substantial life insurance regardless of whether the 10 billion yen really exists or not. However, he will hide this part from Natsui and reason that this is the only way to protect Jessica. Peace Beatrice explains that she won't make them help commit any weird crimes. She just wants to put on a performance to entertain a certain person. They have a relationship founded on enjoying and arguing about mystery novels, so she wants to celebrate his return after 6 years by putting on a mystery for him. Beto says that Kraus and Natsui's roles will be to act as characters in Peace Beatrice's play and follow her scenario. If they fail to do that, or they do anything to interfere with her story, the deal will be off. Peace Beatrice has the key to the underground passage, which is the only way to reach safety from the bomb, and she'll promise to hand it over after the completion of the performance. However, Kraus will privately wonder if even the bomb threat is just an act to get their cooperation. He'll vow to oppose her the moment she tries to hurt his family, but she'll just laugh at him. With this, Natsui and Kraus have become accomplices, and all of the servants have already been made accomplices as well. The next part is concerning the first Twilight. At the family conference, the siblings try to pressure Kraus to bring out Kinzo. However, Peace Beatrice's scenario calls for Kraus and Natsui to stall the family conference until midnight, at which time there will be a knock on the dining room door. At midnight, Genji knocks on the door. Kraus tries to answer nonchalantly, but his voice cracks slightly due to the stress. Genji tells the adults that the master had summoned them. They all go upstairs, but Genji tells Natsui and Kraus that they are to wait outside, which invites some barbs from Eva. Hideyoshi, Eva, Rudolph, Kyrie and Rosa go inside and meet Peace Beatrice and Kinzo. To their surprise and dismay, Genji introduces Peace Beatrice as the head of the family. Kinzo is in high spirits and explains that he just handed over his fortune and the head's ring to her. Beto explains that naturally they aren't really talking to Kinzo, and anyone who knew that Kinzo had already died would consider it a cheap illusion. An illusion is just a falsified process leading up to the observed result, which in this case is that the 5 adults are going to die cruelly in the study. Peace Beatrice asks if anyone figured out why she gathered them together. As a hint, she says there's a reason she left Natsui and Kraus outside. Genji doesn't count since she still has a use for him. Not even Kinzo knows the answer, so she gives another hint. What did the tolling of the clock in the reception hall just now indicate? They still can't figure it out, and Peace Beatrice feigns disappointment. She starts pondering out loud who to summon, and decides to invite a new guest for the first time in a while. Beto picks a demon at random from the Key of Solomon. She gets number 64, Flauros. She decides the demon should have a childish personality and look to contrast Gab and Ronave, someone who is murderous in an innocent way. Flauros Furachan, that has a nice ring to it, yeah. Let's see here, appears as a leopard. When taking the form of a human, has the shape of a man. A man? I'd rather it was a cute girl. Let's change that. I'll go with a cute girl who looks good with animal ears. Sakataro's ears were cute, so something like that. I'll try sketching her. Beto lays out her plan to cover up the murders. She'll have Natsui and Kraus pretend they saw something of what happened. It'd be good to get some dust on their clothes from the study beforehand to match up with a struggle. They'll luckily manage to flee from the study with Peace Beatrice laughing behind them. They'll try to call the police but won't be able to get through, so they'll flee to the guest house in a panic. Beto notes that Shannon and Cannon can't go to the guest house together in this situation, so she will have to be careful. A simple plan would be to have Shannon and Natsui arrive first and say that Cannon and Kraus are getting guns for protection, so they'll arrive later. Shannon will go into the servants' room with a trembling Kumasawa, sneak out the door and meet up with Kraus. After that, there will be a siege in the guest house for a while. The cousins will probably want to leave, either to check the crime scenes or to get revenge for their parents. If they are too insistent, it would be okay to have everyone go to the study again. Genji has a key, so the other lock isn't a problem. When they see a bizarre crime scene with huge holes in the walls, they'll surely be able to accept it couldn't have been done by a human. If that happens, it would be interesting if a magic circle that wasn't there before suddenly appeared. It would be fine to draw it a few days before and have Kraus and Natsui lie about it not being there. To increase the number of mysteries, they could be given a letter from the culprit to have mysteriously appear in a locked room situation. For instance, after a room is confirmed empty and locked, they could go in and later discover the letter. This would be a good place to have the first mystery argument in the higher world. Without suspecting those two, it would only be explainable as magic. They will probably only be able to think of location type tricks involving things like the state of the lock, the windows or the gap under the door. However, this is a true locked room with no one hiding inside. If Beto confirms that with a bunch of red truth, they'll probably give up since they only have experience with false locked rooms. Beto launches into a discussion of locked room taxonomies. Carr's lecture has many kinds of false locked room tricks, and for a large number of people, these have become synonymous with the mystery genre. However, that means that false locked rooms become the limit of those people's reasoning for locked room mysteries. Beto is careful to say that she isn't criticizing that kind of trick, but rather the small group of narrow-minded people who think that's all there is because they don't have experience with anything else. Beto says that while Carr's taxonomy does also list true locked rooms, when she confirms that one is a true locked room with red truth, it might be easier to use Anthony Bocher's taxonomy. Bocher divides true locked rooms into 3 types by when the crime was committed. 1. Before the room was sealed. 2. While the room was sealed. And 3. After the room was broken into. In the case of the mysterious letter, if type 2 is denied with the red truth, then it should be natural to doubt either the ones who initially confirmed the room was empty or the ones who broke into and found the letter. In either case, it should be obvious that someone in the Ushimiya family is cooperating with the culprit. And as the sole surviving witnesses of the first murders, who are claiming that a witch summoned a demon to kill everyone, Krause and Tsui should instantly become the prime suspects. The next part is about the second Twilight. George escorts Shannon to the bathroom and waits outside for her. She sneaks out of the window. A short while later, Kumasawa also goes in, locks the window and screams to announce an incident. George charges inside and sees a magic circle painted on one of the stalls. He thinks that Shannon could have gone out of the window, but it's locked and he can't understand why she would have done something like that anyway. Meanwhile, Kumasawa quote-unquote discovers a letter announcing the second Twilight. Beto explains that to make it look like Flowers is responsible, the bathroom stall has to be prepared to look like it was charred with flames or that it exploded from the inside. The traces can be prepared beforehand, but there's a possibility one of the girls could wander into the stall earlier in the day. To prevent this, the bathroom could be declared off limits the day before, which would also be interesting as a clue to the trick. Or else, if the traces aren't visible from outside, they could be hidden just by keeping the stall door closed. That would make it possible to ask the question, nobody was supposed to be there, so who was using that stall? That line of reasoning should lead to the answer about when the magic circle was drawn. It should be easy to doubt Kumasawa and Shannon here, so Natsui will raise the doubt against the servants. In mystery novels, plausible theories raised by the characters have a high probability of being wrong, so that tendency can be turned around and used as a weapon to deflect the reader's attention from the truth. Krause will talk things over with the servants and the result will be to split into a family group and a servant group, and have both groups barricade themselves in. The family will stay in the guest house and the servants will go to the mansion. George will probably insist on searching for Shannon outside, but he can do that as much as he likes. The storm will probably drive him back into the guest house eventually. The next part is about all the other Twilights. Beto explains that the servants will then meet up with Peace Beatrice in the mansion to discuss their next moves. The 4th through 8th Twilights will be an episode 3 style chain murder. The selling point of a chain murder is that you can control the order of discovery of the bodies. With the exception of Genji, each of the servants have been bribed with 1 billion yen in exchange for their cooperation in what they believe to be a harmless mystery performance. They have been told that they only get the money if they play their parts correctly. But in reality, Peace Beatrice already sent the money, the letters received post-incident, several days ago. They won't be able to collect it, but their surviving relatives will. They are also unaware that the 5 people in the study were actually killed. Beto explains that it's easier to control them this way under the current circumstances, although it's a case-by-case thing. They currently believe that they are just going to play dead for a while. Goda is nervous about screwing up, but Kumasawa is starting to enjoy herself. Everyone goes to their assigned rooms and begins preparing their respective crime scenes. The room assignments are Cannon in the first floor parlor, Genji in the second floor VIP guest room, Kumasawa on the second floor in Natsui's room, Goda on the third floor servant break room, and Shannon in the chapel. Peace Beatrice joins Kumasawa and they have a friendly chat. She tells Kumasawa to pick a comfortable position that she can hold for a long time. Although she will be able to relax after Nanjo finishes his fake autopsy and the room is sealed for the police. Kumasawa even brought a book and snacks. Peace Beatrice convinces Kumasawa to lie face down so she can check whether it looks more realistic. Then she takes a cord out of her bag and throttles Kumasawa with it. She apologizes to the corpse, explaining that the location for this Twilight is the ankle, and leaving Kumasawa to die just from that would make her suffer unnecessarily. Peace Beatrice takes out a rifle and shoots the corpse's ankle with it. Unlike the movies, the gunshot is only about as loud as popping a cork from a wine bottle. She then digs out the bullet with a pair of forceps and puts it in her bag, which already contains several other bloodstained bullets. She notes out loud that while the 4th and 5th Twilights can be carried out with just a gun, after that it becomes more complicated, so killing a big man like Goda will be difficult unless she makes him one of those two. She jams a stake into the wound, putting all her weight into it. It looks unstable, so it might fall out later, but it's enough to make it look like the stake is a weapon for gouging sacrifices. Beto explains that she now killed Kumasawa, Goda and Genji. Kanon can't die yet because he has still work to do. He takes his time going around and painting magic circles on the doors of all of the crime scenes. Beto reasons that the chapel is far away from the mansion and won't be discovered by accident. The 2nd floor rooms in the mansion might be found, but they are all locked, so the survivors will have to break in via a window. Therefore, they'll most certainly break into the parlor first. Inside, they will find Kanon dead with a master key in his pocket. There will be a ladder from the witch nearby containing a key to the next crime scene, so the survivors will begin following the prearranged route. The survivors can be prevented from examining the crime scenes closely under the pretense that it needs to be preserved from the police. Natsui will have to hold back the children, and only Kraus and Nanjo will examine the body. Jessica in particular might try to run over to Kanon, so they have to be especially careful about that. The survivors find Kanon. Nanjo announces that he can't be certain of the cause of death, except that the stake found on the ground near the wound in Kanon's knee probably wasn't what killed him. Kraus apologizes to Kanon for not trusting the servants. Maria points out that this is the 7th Twilight, so George realizes that there must be at least 3 victims. Battler, with a question mark, apparently it's not clear if Battler is really present on the scene, Battler tries to calm him down. Kraus shuts the storm shutter, saying that he can't leave the broken window alone. Meanwhile, Jessica does indeed try to go to Kanon's side, but Natsui manages to keep her away, saying that she can't disturb the scene. Beto explains that they'll head to the VIP guest room, then Natsui's room, then the servants' break room. While they're busy, Kanon will just walk out of the parlor door and relock it, since he had 2 master keys to start with. He can just leave one inside the room and lock the door with the other one. After the epitaph is completed, there's a danger that someone might come back and check the crime scenes again, and thereby discover that Kanon is missing. To prevent a contradiction, it'll be necessary to attribute the theft of his body to the culprit, but that's fine because it creates another mystery. The next part is about the 4th Twilight. Kanon meets up with Shannon and P.S. Beatrice at the chapel, and Shannon asks how it went. He says it was just sleeping and it was easier than carrying fertilizer around. Beato thanks him for his hard work and says his role on this game board is finished. Kanon says he'll see both of them again on the next board, and P.S. Beatrice makes him disappear. Shannon and P.S. Beatrice go inside the chapel. After some searching, Shannon finds a small 20 cm gap between the altar in the back and the stained glass window behind it. She ties one end of a cord to a small weight and dangles it in the gap. She ties the other end to a handgun. The weight is heavier than the gun, so the gun should fall into the gap when she lets go of it. P.S. Beatrice says that it's going to be difficult to get the blood on Shannon's stake right. She smears the stake with a kind of paint that is used in the movies. Shannon trades the gun for the stake. Both are pressed up against Shannon's forehead. Do you have any regrets? None. Everything I do is for you, Beatrice-sama. It's a shame. If someone had solved the epitaph, you wouldn't have to die either. There's no way anyone could solve such a difficult riddle. It was a hopeless bet from the very beginning. I made the bet in spite of that. A miracle that occurs in spite of such odds is worthy of being called magic. In this human world filled with toxin, there are no magic spells or miracles, Beatrice-sama. You are the only witch, and the only one who can bring magic into this world. That's right, I am the Golden Witch Beatrice. Sleep peacefully. When next you awaken, you will be in the Golden Land. Your beloved George will be there with you. Thank you very much, Beatrice-sama. P.S. Beatrice pulls the trigger and Shannon slumps over. P.S. Beatrice lets go of the gun and the weight pulls it into the gap behind the altar. She notes that it looks like the stake fell out of Shannon's forehead when she collapsed. She places an envelope containing the key to the parlor next to the body, and also adds a letter indicating that she stole Kanon's corpse for another part of the resurrection ritual, which ought to send the survivors running back to the parlor to check on his body. Now, that does it for the epitaph serial murders, right? How is it, Battler? I hope you enjoy my mystery. Beato says that since she went to the trouble of summoning Flauros, so go ahead and make Canon's disappearance her fault. Something like, after Canon died, his spirit was attacked by her and P.S. Beatrice, and after a useless struggle, Flauros swallowed him whole. With the serial murder finished, all that's left is to rewrite the story with a fantasy narrative pinning everything on the new demon. And here ends the summary of Umineko Our Confession. So, first of all, I have no problem accepting that at least in Our Confession, Shannon indeed is the culprit, and even that she is the same person as Canon. That doesn't affect my theory at all, since I believe that Our Confession has no actual bearing on the truth in the first place. It's a fiction, a challenge and a guide, but not an answer book. When it comes to the perspective from which the story is told, it's told from Delanor's perspective, and therefore I see it as almost equal to Delanor's version of what happened in the 5th game. Namely, Erika's theory with Natsui as the culprit and Kinzo as an accomplice. Just like that theory had no bearing on the actual truth of the 5th game, in fact it was even impossible, in the same way I regard Umineko Our Confession as a fictional description of a game in which the official explanation is indeed true and all the inconsistencies that come along with it. Therefore I see it not only as a guide on how to think, as there was some pretty good reasoning going on, but also very much as a guide on how not to think. Because basically you need to be able to see through some bad reasoning that goes on in Our Confession as well. In other words, in order to be quote-unquote qualified to understand the truth behind the games of Umineko, not only do you have to take notice of the good reasoning that goes on in Umineko Our Confession, but you also need to be able to see that some bad reasoning is going on as well. It may be a bit pessimistic, but I will only focus on the hints on how not to think. In other words, the things that you should be able to see through. And one of the finest examples of this would be the section on accomplices. The section on accomplices is an excellent guide on how not to think. I don't mean this as an insult, but I find it hard to believe that people can actually buy the sloppy reasoning that is going on here. I have in fact seen many people respond to Umineko Our Confession in general with comments like, wow, the characters act like morons and this and that doesn't make sense at all. Yet they never dare to question the author's motives and intentions. In my view, especially the section on accomplices is basically a test for the viewer that says, if you fall for this, you are essentially not worthy of understanding Umineko. So let me explain a bit about the issue of accomplices. It is incredibly difficult to get someone's cooperation in a murder scheme. Even in this case, where Kraus and Natsui wouldn't necessarily know that people really would get hurt, but they would be the biggest idiots ever for not realizing that people will most likely get hurt. After all, they are dealing with someone who is threatening them with a gun and a bomb. Whether or not the bomb is actually real, the person in question is at least threatening them with it. So the threat is real. Whether or not the bomb is not really that important. So the threat itself is at least real. You need to understand that the main problem for making someone into your accomplice is the following. The chances of retaliation are extremely high. Let's place yourself in the shoes of the culprit. Accomplices may be important for you or even necessary, but they are the most dangerous people for you. Unless you have them under constant threat by holding one of their loved ones hostage, for example, you should fear retaliation at the first moment they get. After all, you are not their friend but their worst enemy, so they will not happily play along in the first place. And they will probably seek to get revenge even if you do succeed. Therefore, you should never ever leave yourself in a weak position in which they would have the upper hand. For example, if you believe Rosa is Shannon's accomplice in the second game, then Shannon would be the dumbest culprit ever, leaving herself exposed to Rosa at multiple times when Rosa is the one holding the gun. Especially if she knows where the money is already and that you are holding the key to the underground VIP room. Bribing accomplices is not as easy as it sounds either. Money may seem like a fine motive for an accomplice, but it's not that simple. After all, if they can also find a way to get the money and taking you down in the process, they wouldn't hesitate to take that route. After all, they will never ever trust you in the first place. So even if you promise them money, they will probably expect that you will try to kill them anyway. People who threaten your family and hold up a gun in your face are not the most trustworthy people imaginable. Also, if you increase the amount of accomplices, you also increase the amount of danger you are in. Because controlling a whole group of people who don't trust you, don't care for your cause, and will want revenge for being threatened in the first place is not really something that is beneficial for you. The best kind of accomplice is the one who has a strong motive of his own, especially someone who is helping you for someone else's sake and hasn't much to lose himself. This applies to Dr. Nanjo, who is doing it for the sake of his grandchild. Moreover, he's an old man himself with less to lose than someone with their whole lives ahead of them. Moreover, he's not part of the family to begin with, so he would probably be willing to sacrifice the Uchiha family for his own family's sake. Also, he doesn't need money out of greed, which is a feeling that can be abandoned when your life is endangered. But instead, he does it to save someone else's life. So Nanjo is a very suitable accomplice. Retaliation on his part is far less likely, and he has a pressing motive to get the money. Also, in my theory, there are two culprits and one accomplice instead of one culprit and a multitude of accomplices. In my theory, the accomplice is in the weaker position, because even if Nanjo retaliates against Rosa, he still has the young martial artist George to deal with, being an old guy himself. Nevertheless, even Nanjo is very dangerous to the culprits. As you saw in my explanation of the first 4 games, Nanjo probably retaliated in the 3rd game by trying to kill George, and perhaps in the 4th game by releasing the hostages. In other words, Nanjo is not an accomplice under threat, and also not an accomplice based on some arbitrary bribe. When it comes to getting people to cooperate under threat, you need a very different approach, like in my theory in the 2nd novel. Here the forced accomplices are under constant threat, as Kumasawa is held hostage by Nanjo and Rosa is the only one holding a gun. Then, after you get those people to do what you wanted them to do, you need to isolate them and then finish them off. That's exactly what happens in my theory, as the people are split up into 3 groups with either a culprit or accomplice in each group. We have Kumasawa threatened by Nanjo, we have Rosa keeping an eye on Battler, and we have George keeping an eye on the rest. That's also the last time Battler gets into contact with any of them, apart from Genji. But we all know what kind of a robot Genji is. That unusual personality of him is extremely beneficial to the culprits, and therefore he can be left by himself. The 2nd game is executed almost perfectly by Rosa, George and Nanjo, as they take little risk. Actually, the most risky part is when Rosa is at the chapel with the servants and when she met up with Shannon and Genji in Kinzo's study. However, she had no master key at that time, and she had Nanjo place Cannon's key back on Jessica's corpse. So it would have seemed impossible for Rosa to be the culprit. Even more, she provided Shannon and Genji with an alibi, which would make it unlikely that they would put suspicion on her in return. And when it comes to Goda and Kumasawa in the 4th game, they are under constant surveillance of George and then isolated in the garden shed and then killed before Battler sees them again. So in the actual games, given my theory, the issue of accomplices actually makes sense and the culprits are pretty careful. But in Umineko Our Confession, we are treated with a laughably weak plot in which Shannon makes Krause and Natsui accomplices with a half-baked threat she can hardly prove to begin with. Moreover, she reveals that the money can already be collected using the card she is holding. Add to that the fact that there are multiple guns in the mansion and she's just a lonely weak little girl, and we are dealing with a situation in which Krause and Natsui could take her out at almost any moment. And yes, she promised that no one would get hurt, but would you believe a maniac saying that while holding a gun to your head? Moreover, their family is getting butchered in the study and they are pretty much okay with that, and never suspect that they might become victims as well. And then there is the issue of all other servants being made accomplices. Basically, they were led to believe that they were getting paid 1 billion yen each in order to pull a prank on the family. Let me repeat that. They were led to believe that they were getting paid 1 billion yen each in order to pull a prank on the family. Let me repeat that a 3rd time. They were led to believe that they were getting paid 1 billion yen each in order to pull a prank on the family. Here the gullibility of the reader is again put to the test. I mean, come on, if someone offers you 1 billion fucking yen for acting out a role in some sort of cruel prank, then wouldn't you think there is something fishy? Never expect any ulterior motive, never expect any danger. You would just go along with it and say, sure, that makes sense to pay 1 billion freaking yen per person for some sick sort of prank. Sure, I'll buy that. I mean, I can perfectly well trust someone who wants to make someone believe that his loved ones are getting slaughtered and pay several billion yen to get that done. And of course, I will never expect that I myself may become an actual real victim. Nah, this is not in any way a dangerous situation. Again, an obvious test which you should be able to see through. Okay, I'm being a bit comedic here, but I don't want people to misunderstand my point, so let me clarify it a bit. When it comes to a motive in a mystery novel, any motive will inevitably be somewhat unsatisfying to most people. That's the case in all mystery novels and even in real-life murder cases. One of the reasons for that is that everyone will tend to say, even if I was in a position like that, I would still not have committed murder. There are lots of other ways to have dealt with a situation like that. And of course, any fictional story contains some implausible elements. And that's of course completely okay. I mean, it's not my intention to just mock anything here, because anyone can do that about any explanation. After all, one could also say something similar about George, like, oh, I love my girlfriend so much, but my family won't let us be together. You know what, let's just viciously slaughter them together with my wicked witch aunt. So that's not the point I'm making. You can mock basically any explanation in any mystery novel that way. What it is about is showing you that a piece of the puzzle really doesn't fit at the place where it is being forced into. There is acceptable unrealism and there is unacceptable unrealism basically. For example, if in a mystery novel the solution is that someone went into a second floor window by taking a running jump, that's an example of unacceptable unrealism. But if that specific character was introduced as a professional athlete, for example, holding the record for the highest jump or something along those lines, then it becomes something that is in the end, in and of itself rather unrealistic, but within the boundaries of this fictional story is an acceptable solution. However, how satisfying it is to the reader depends upon the reader himself. Perhaps that's not the greatest example, but I hope you know what I'm getting at. Remember that it is my theory that our confession is there to support the second story, namely the official explanation, yet meant to be seen through. I mean, are the servants ever introduced as greedy, money-hungry, or even in need for a large sum of money? Are they ever introduced as so gullible as to blindly trust the new family head under any given circumstances? For example, that it would make sense for the old Kumasawa to either be fooled that Eva and Hideyoshi were just playing dead with stakes through their skulls in the first novel, or be so money hungry that she would be okay to help the culprit without being desperate for money in the first place. Of course, in the case of Genji it's a different story, as we have come to know him as having a sort of robot-like personality, that it's neither about greed nor about gullibility, but rather about blind obedience. But apart from him, basically the people in our confession are acting really out of character to begin with. And I'm not the only one who says that. I've seen a lot of Chicanatries believers actually saying that as well. What's probably even worse in our confession is that Shannon provided no safeguards for her scheme at all, which would actually be the case in other games as well. After all, Nanji would have been in the position to know whether the victims were truly dead or not, and therefore would have known that Shannon truly killed herself. And of course, Natsui and Kraus could have killed her at about any unguarded moment. And when it comes to the supposed accomplices in the actual games, things become even worse, as I already talked about, for example way back in chapter 3, concerning Rosa as Shannon's supposed accomplice. In both that case and Nanjo's case in our confession, the accomplices somehow stay loyal even after the culprit is dead. So remember that it's not about mocking, because my theory can be portrayed in a silly way as well, as could any explanation about any mystery novel. It's about it fitting the characters and the story. I believe that the accomplices' motives are purposefully stretched to a level of silliness, exactly because our confession is not only meant as a guide on how to think, but also a guide on how not to think. There is also some good reasoning going on, of course. Especially how plausible theories stated by the characters will lead the readers to actually doubt those theories. That was a really good point, I think. And of course we have another contradiction with how Shannon and Cannon act towards Beatrice and how Beatrice acts towards them. In the second and third novel they are worst enemies, and here Shannon says, "Everything I do is for you, Beatrice-sama," but most people will probably not notice that contradiction either. But my betrayal theory actually accounts for why the relationship between Beatrice, Shannon and Cannon changes. So that's my view on Umineko Our Confession. I might have to say more about it once I read the full translation. By now I have explained every game and how everything relates to what happened on the island. But there is one perspective that I haven't yet fully explained, and that's Ange's perspective. Not only my views on the games are, to say the least, controversial, but actually my view on Ange's perspective and even on the meta world are very different from how they are generally perceived. And in all honesty, I'm sort of surprised that Ange's perspective is not viewed with a lot more skepticism by most readers. After all, the general view is that Ange's perspective is basically the real world. In other words, that Ange is the real protagonist of Umineko, and her perspective conveys reality to us while the games are mere fiction. In fact, the general view is that the games literally are fictional stories, physically written down by Ikiku and or Toya Battler. I didn't really make this distinction in the previous part, but I'll refer to the female author as Ikiku and the future version of Battler as Toya. Now, I did pretty much already state my position regarding Ange's perspective in chapter 3, but before I go into that, I first need to make one thing very clear, and that is the following. I believe that it's in the end impossible to prove what the true nature is of Ange's world and her perspective of that world. But also, I believe that it's possible to at least prove with reasonable certainty what is not true about Ange's perspective and her world. And this is even more applicable to the meta world, which I will go into a little bit in this chapter, but I will discuss it more in depth in the final chapter. Now let's summarize the main points of the more general view on Ange's perspective and my own view. The general view of Ange's world is basically the following. It's the real world, or the real future. Ange's perspective is more or less objective. Ange didn't die, however this view varies. Battler and Eva survived, at least in Rokkenjima Prime, which would be Ange's world. Ikiku is a real person and wrote the games, and she wrote it together with Toya Battler. And Rokkenjima Prime is almost completely unknown. However, my view consists of the following points. It's a counterfactual future that resulted from the third game. Ange's perspective is extremely subjective and largely fictional. Ange died. In fact, she died 2 if not 3 times. Battler didn't survive. Eva did, but not in the real world. Ikiku is probably a fictional character altogether. There may have been bottle forgeries written, but those were not the games we have been reading about. Toya Battler is a fictional character. Rokkenjima Prime doesn't exist in Ange's world, as her future originated from the third game. Rokkenjima Prime may very well be the first game, the second game or the fourth game, and I believe it's the second game. Well, I would like to say now which view is true, but as I said before, I don't think it can objectively be determined what the truth is about Ange's world. So a better question would be, which view better fits and which view has evidence against it? Let's go point by point. What is the evidence in favor of Ange's world being the real future? Well, there isn't any, now is there? And this is not meant in a mocking way, I'm being serious here. There literally is no evidence that Ange's world is real. Even the most enthusiastic believer in the reality of Ange's world would have to admit that. There are no read statements to support this view, and there is no circumstantial evidence in favor of it. Now you might say, but there is at least the claim that it's the real future. Well, no, not even that. When you think about it, even in my view, the characters in Ange's world would at least perceive their world as the real world. After all, in my view, Ange's perspective is a possible future, and obviously the characters in it would not think in terms like alternate futures. They would perceive their world as the only real world, which would be true of the characters in any possible timeline. Of course, one needs to appreciate that it would be extremely difficult to distinguish between a future and the future without relying on read truth. And not just any read truth, but general statements that are not contingent upon a specific game. So what is the evidence in support of Ange's world being a counterfactual future that resulted from the third game? As I said before, I don't think this view can ultimately be proven, but does it fit the story? And there I would say it absolutely does. Think back to chapter 3 in which I gave my Eva's escape to Kubidorian argument. Why? Because it actually explains things. Why did Eva survive? Explained by my theory. Why did Eva survive? Explained by my theory. How did Eva know about the tunnel and the bomb? Explained by my theory. How did Eva get Kinzo's ring? Explained by my theory. How did Eva learn the truth? Explained by my theory. Why did Eva keep the truth a secret? Explained by my theory. And why would Eva rather have people regard her as the culprit than to reveal the truth? Again, also explained by my theory. In other words, my theory actually makes sense of these things in Ange's perspective. Of course, believers in the other view can quote-unquote explain this in other ways, but since Rokkinjima Prime, which they believe is what preceded Ange's perspective, is almost completely unknown and unknowable, absolutely everything you say to account for these things will be based on complete and utter speculation. But in my theory, these things actually have an explanation based on earlier parts in the story instead of pure speculation. Also, there's a connection to the real culprit and why Ange's world turned out the way it did. Which is not really the case in the general view. After all, is Shannon really the culprit in Rokkinjima Prime? Well, that's debatable. Is the canon theory even relevant to explain Rokkinjima Prime? Well, that's very debatable as well. So in that sense, my view fits better into the story as a whole, at the very least in regards to these points. Now, is there evidence against my view that Ange's world is merely a counterfactual future? Well, that would have to come from my viewers because I am not aware of any evidence against it. So if anyone has an objection, please let me know. But I advise you to first finish this chapter before posting your objections, because I've only just started on this topic of Ange's world. Now, is there evidence against Ange's world being the real world? Well, I would say there is. In fact, there are several read statements that conflict with the notion that Ange's world is real. Let's review those statements. First, there is the following statement from the fourth novel. Quote, "Because of your sin, people die. Due to your sin, a great many humans on this island die. No one escapes, all die." This read statement was made by Beatrice in the fourth game. If we take the statement as a general statement, then it seems to proclaim that everyone on the island dies, meaning not a single survivor. Not only Bella doesn't survive, but even Eva would not make it off the island alive. Now I think that there can be two general counter-arguments to this read. The first objection would be, it's not a general statement. When it comes to the first objection, I would say that it's baseless and arbitrary. After all, the read is about Bella's sin and its consequences. Bella's sin isn't just about the fourth game either, so why apply the rest of the statement only to the fourth game? Basically, what you would be saying is that the first part is general and the second part is only about the fourth game. That's really arbitrary and baseless. The second objection is the claim that it merely talks about a great many humans who die. I don't know about the original Japanese, but in the English translation it definitely doesn't talk about a great many humans among all the people on the island. After all, it says that no one escapes, all die. That would be redundant if that's only true about the people among the total number of people on the island who die. Of course the people who die do not escape the island, that's obvious. In fact, what the statement does is specifying the people who die. First it says that people die, then that this is in regard to a great amount of people, and then it clarifies that these are all the people who die and that no one escapes. Actually, Beatrice makes it really clear that not a single person will survive. No one escapes, all die. Basically, the statement could also have been phrased like this. All people on the island will die, not a single person will escape. So a great many humans die because of your sin. At least that's how I read it, and I don't really see how it could mean anything else. So if you want to argue for a different meaning, it would have to come from the original Japanese. The next read statement is this one. Quote, "That's right, I'm Ange, the Urushiimiya Ange of a world where no one comes home. My entire family never came home from Rokkinjima that day." Now, unless there are two words for family in Japanese, this statement confirms that absolutely no one came back from the island that day, not even Eva. I don't speak Japanese, so I don't know if there are two different words for family in Japanese. In English there is only one word for both your entire family and your immediate family. In Dutch, I'm from the Netherlands, there are two different words to refer to your family as a whole and your immediate family consisting of your parents and siblings. I don't know if that's also the case in Japanese. But if that's not the case, meaning that Ange is talking about her family as a whole here, this red proves that nobody came home from Rokkinjima. At least, not for this Ange, as I believe there to be multiple Anges, but I'll talk about it later. However, using the same logic of multiple Anges, and you are in fact forced to do that, believers in the reality of Ange's world can claim that this red truth is only applicable to a fictional Ange. After all, this red appears in the fourth novel by Gretel Ange. So believers in the reality of Ange's world can simply say, yes, for the fictional character Ange, created by Toya and Ikiku in one of the forgeries, it is indeed the case that no one returned to her. But for the real Ange, Eva did in fact return to her. And basically that's fine, I can't disprove that assertion. If I were in your shoes, I would say the same thing. But I do have a couple of things to say about that position that make it less sensible than my position. 1. You need to acknowledge that it's merely an assertion that Gretel Ange and the real Ange had a different fate. 2. Why wouldn't Gretel Ange reflect the real Ange in the sense of her fate? After all, Ange has no relation to the games in the first place. So why does this fictional Ange have a different future than the real Ange? Toya and Ikiku would have been very much aware that Eva survived. And 3. The only statements that appear in red concerning Ange's future are things that seem to confirm that no one on the island survived. There is never anything in red even remotely suggesting that Eva, or anyone else for that matter, survived. So it's not about whether or not it's possible to make these red statements compatible with the view that Ange's world is the real world. The point is that these red statements actually fit given my position and are at the very least somewhat out of place in the position that Ange's world is real. And I want to add to that it actually makes sense in my view why Gretel Ange and regular Ange would have different fates, as they are two completely different persons existing in completely different timelines. Then there is a third red statement. Quote, Beatrice died in October of 1986, therefore the Golden Land she created was completely destroyed. Your family, which was made to live in the Golden Land, was destroyed along with it. Your father, mother, and of course Battler will never return to you again and will never speak your name again. Of course, here we have the same issue again with what the word family means. Either way, this is again a red statement that fits perfectly with my view that in reality no one survived and escaped the island. When it comes to Battler, many people of course believe that Battler did survive but lost his memory, but I will address that later on. So although these red statements are not conclusive, because you can intellectually tap dance your way around them, they do at least fit perfectly well with my position, and they are somewhat out of place at least if Ange's world is real. One should also wonder why there is simply nothing that ever confirms that Ange's world is real. Okay, next point. The objectivity or subjectivity of Ange's perspective. If Ange's perspective can be shown to be unreliable or even largely fictional, then it really speaks against Ange's world being real. After all, what is the point of Ange's world being real if we don't get to know anything about it objectively? In that case, even if Ange's world would be real, you would still know nothing about it. And here I think the evidence speaks massively in favor of Ange's perspective being both subjective and largely fictional. Let me outline the reasons why that would have to be the case. Ange dies 2 if not 3 times. Ange sees quote-unquote magical things. Some parts in Ange's perspective are necessarily fictional, like her being on the island as a young girl. Gretel Ange and regular Ange are depicted as if they are the same person, which they necessarily cannot be. And Ikiku uses the red truth in what should be the real world, but the red truth cannot exist in the real world. And a separate point that is a foundational problem for the position that Ange's world is real, namely, it is impossible to distinguish what Ange really experiences and what is either delusional, fictional or metafictional. The first point is probably the most crucial one. We see 2 scenes in which Ange jumps off a skyscraper. The first one is right after Eva died and before she talks to Okanogi and goes on a trip with Amakusa, as Ange talks about her jumping off the skyscraper with Okanogi. However, it is impossible for Ange to survive such a fall. Even a safety net could not save her when falling with terminal velocity. Even Bernkastel affirms this. In other words, her whole trip with Amakusa, where she goes to Rokkinjima and where she goes to meet Ikiku, all happens after she jumped off a skyscraper. She even refers to it when talking to Ikiku at the end of the tea party of the 6th novel. Then, after she reads Eva's diary, she is again on that same skyscraper in the same situation and jumps down again to write what she calls her own human blood-red truth. So she dies again. And, arguably, she should also have been killed by Amakusa after he sniped all the Yakuza guys and Aunt Kasumi, as the trick ending shows his plan was. So if you believe in the reality of Ange's world, you need to make a concession. Either Ange's whole trip with Amakusa was fictional and therefore didn't happen, and the scene in which Ange first jumps down was real, which undermines your entire view, because then the only thing that was real about Ange's world was the scene in which Eva died and the scene in which Ange died, and all other things were fictional. So that would basically be self-contradictory. Or you would have to accept that the scene in which Ange first jumps down was fictional. But then you have already conceded that Ange's world contains fictional scenes, and one could then also argue that Eva dying was fictional as well. In fact, you could even say that Eva being alive was all in Ange's head to begin with, or something. Or Ange jumping down was metafictional, in which case Ange's whole trip, including meeting Ikiku, could also have been just one of her stories. Even Eva being alive and dying could have been part of that same story. In fact, maybe the living Ange is just a character in Ikiku's stories to begin with. Basically, there is no end to what you could include in that metafiction. Then Ange jumps down a second time after reading Eva's diary. Again, something that people who believe that the ending is real also need to reject. So that's yet another fictional scene. After all, Ange could not have jumped down the skyscraper at all if her world and the ending are real. The next point is that Ange sees magical things. She basically has imaginary friends, namely Maria and the Sisters of Purgatory, and she also sees Ikiku as the witch Aurora and her cat as Bernkastel. Obviously, those things aren't really out there in the real world. That's simply Ange's perception, or in other words, it's all in her head. Which makes her view either delusional or at the very least subjective, as she sees the world not as it truly is. Then there is of course the admitted fiction, namely Ange in the fourth game and Ange as a young girl on Rokkinjima. Both would be believed to have been written by Ikiku, or some people would argue that Twilight of the Golden Witch was written by Ange, even though Aurora is actually seen writing in that novel when she killed Lambda Delta. However, in the case of Gretel Ange, she is treated as the same person as the regular Ange. The same person who reads Maria's diary, the same person who went to Rokkinjima with Amakusa, and she even takes a break from the meta world to return to her own world again. So if Gretel Ange is metafictional, how do you know that not absolutely everything Ange experiences in the fourth novel is just metafictional? So Eva dying could be metafictional, Ange jumping down the skyscraper would obviously be metafictional, Ange reading Maria's diary could be metafictional, her conversations with Amakusa could be metafictional, etc. How would you know? How could you even know? The same applies to Twilight. Which scenes are metafictional or delusional, and which one are not? Basically, you would have to argue that the entirety of Twilight is metafiction or a delusion, except for the very end of it. But then again, how do you know that that's not metafictional or a delusion either? But then again, how do you know that that's not metafictional or a delusion? And when Ange first meets Ikiku in the sixth novel, is that real? Well, Aurora obviously is just in Ange's mind, so it's definitely not viewed from an objective perspective to begin with. So how do you know that this would be real rather than delusional, fictional or metafictional? In fact, in Twilight there is a scene where Ikiku goes to show Eva's diary to the public, but in the end doesn't go through with it. Here we see Ikiku with a character that most people would tend to believe is very much real, namely Professor Otsuki, but here Ikiku speaks in red. You can't speak in red in the real world for obvious reasons, nor would it serve any function because nobody would be able to see it in the first place. Also, since she doesn't actually show it in the end, it was redundant anyway whether it was real or not. It wouldn't have made a difference. Also, Ikiku says in red that Eva's diary contains the truth. But how is she in a position to know that? She hasn't even read it in the first place, because she also says in red that Ange will be the first to read it. In other words, after Eva wrote the truth down, she sealed up her diary and nobody laid eyes on its contents until Ange unsealed it and read it. But it's actually not even the issue how Ikiku can know it. It's how she can guarantee it in red to Ange if this supposedly happens in the real world. Red cannot exist in the real world, so saying something in red to Ange would be impossible. It would also be meaningless as Ange literally would be incapable of seeing it. You can't see what people say in the real world. But if these things surrounding Ikiko aren't real, why would any scene in which Ikiko appears be real? How would you know? How could you even know? And that's in the end the fatal problem with the view that Ange's world is the real future. Even if it's the real future, it's irrelevant because it's impossible to know what is real, what is delusional, what is fictional, and what is metafictional. Anyone could claim any scene to be one of those things, and nobody could make any objective argument against it or in favor of it. It leads to complete relativism and global skepticism of anything within the Umineko story. It would be every man for himself, and even the validity of the Red Truth could be doubted on that basis. The entire story basically self-destructs if you take the implication of this view to its logical conclusions. So here's my challenge for dogmatic believers in the reality of Ange's world. Name at least 3 scenes that you believe to be true reality and then prove that it's reality rather than a delusion, a fiction or part of metafiction. I claim that this cannot be done. Well, nevertheless, even though I don't think this challenge can be met, I do know from experience that many Umineko readers have the mental flexibility to make Ange's perspective as being real work somehow. After all, after debating so many believers in the Canon tree's explanation and their ability to make a square peg fit into a round hole, I'm sure that believers in the reality of Ange's world will do the same thing. However, all the problems with Ange's perspective can be solved with one easy blue truth. Ange's world is not the real world. That simple statement solves simply everything regarding Ange's world. And if you add a second blue statement, Ange's world is a fictional and subjective perspective of a counterfactual timeline resulting from the third game, it also explains why Ange's world is the way it is. It actually gets explanatory power that way, as I explained before. Now there's one more thing that needs to be discussed, and that's the ending. And I'm of course talking about the magic ending here, namely the ending in which Battle turns out to be alive but has lost his memory. Now I must say that I'm truly surprised that so many people actually believe that the ending of the story really happened in reality. Because even if I believed in the official explanation, I would still not believe that the ending was real. Even if I accepted both the official explanation and the reality of Ange's world, then I would still conclude that the ending was fictional. So that does not even depend on my other views. The reason for that is that the ending screams to us that it's fictional. Obviously, there neither is nor can be any evidence to support its reality in the first place, but there is much evidence against it being real. First of all, it's not part of the official explanation that it is real, so believers in the official explanation cannot appeal to their usual author's authority claim to begin with. Ryukishi actually said that he wanted the ending to be a mystery. Quote, "Many interpretations can be done concerning the suicide by drowning in the final." To which Ryukishi responded, "But isn't it fascinating that there can be so many interpretations concerning a riddle posted at the end of a story? In a good story there should be mysterious things left at the end. At least that is my concept of it, and I hope that you can accept and enjoy those lingerings. There were so many interesting thoughts on those last scenes." Then Kia said, "Another thing you can have different ideas of is the question what the meaning of the final scene with the golden land in the Fukin house could be." To which Ryukishi responded, "You may as well think of this scene as just showing something nice, as well as showing something sinister. A true solution is not really necessary, all your active thinking is wonderful. I want to give you 100 points just by hearing all those beautiful final ideas. To people who were able until that point, this is like a bonus stage. More than only arriving at the truth, they can now explain how the story ends however they want. People who came this far have reached the stage of Game Master. They can now create a game board for Umineko themselves and enjoy it." Then Kia said, "Because when Battle leaves the island, it's the only scene where he does not scream, 'I'm falling, I'm falling.' This can also be treated as somebody's fantasy. For example, because Ange heard from Captain Kawabata during the scenes in the real world in episode 4 that Battler was always making a fuss about falling when on a boat." To which Ryukishi responded, "That is a truly wonderful deduction, therefore it's probably better if I say nothing at all. Because with everything redundant I'd say, I'll only narrow down all your ideas. Because this has become the game board of a new game master, I will keep my mouth shut. Moreover, Ryukishi also said that the theory that Ange committed suicide after reading Eva's diary, which is what I believe by the way, is also a valid approach. Quote, "The tome of the one and only truth is something, if you take the depiction of the higher plane, something that Ange unlocks herself with a key and then reads. You might also see this as a symbol for Ange maybe reading it on accident on her own. Maybe by reading it, she was able to create her belief in the golden truth. Or maybe it was by reading it that she decided to head for the trick ending." To which Kia responded, "There is also the chance that this book holds something that will very likely make her commit suicide, right?" To which Ryukishi responded, "This is something that the player can understand as he likes, so I won't say anything further, though if you turn the scene around a bit, you can actually arrive at its truth. This work is studded with such hints. If he can arrive there is something that is up to the player. In that sense, Umineko is probably a pretty adult game. I have the impression that Higurashi was a pretty casual story, aimed at a young audience, but Umineko is a pretty bitter story." So, the ending is a mystery and Ryukishi wants the readers to figure it out for themselves. So even from the perspective of the official explanation, there is no official truth regarding the ending to begin with. So that's the first thing you need to keep in mind when reading the ending. If you believe it to be real, that's your own personal interpretation. It's not part of the official explanation to begin with. The second thing you need to keep in mind is the inherent unreliability of Ange's perspective, as I explained before. So that at least already gives you a basis for being skeptical about the reality of the ending. The third thing is that everything from the moment Ange reads Eva's diary on to the very end is about Ange denying truth. Red truth cannot hurt her anymore because she simply denies the truth. She won't believe it. She rather believes in her own golden truth instead. When Ange jumps down the skyscraper, she says that she denies the truth and will write her own blood-red human truth instead. And that's exactly what I believe the ending is. The impossible happy ending that Ange, and many of the readers, wanted to happen, but which had already been denied in Red. As Bernkastel said in Red at the end of the 7th novel, concerning the final game, this game will not have a happy ending. The fourth point is that I'm absolutely not in a million years buying this concept of Battler being dead because of memory loss. The Red goes like this, quote, "Beatrice died in October of 1986, therefore the Golden Land she created was completely destroyed. Your family, which was made to live in the Golden Land, was destroyed along with it. Your father, mother and of course Battler will never return to you again and will never speak your name again. And Battler is dead." Changing your name or forgetting who you are does not kill you, nor does it make you someone else. Even if Battler has lost his memory and took on the name Toya Hachiu, he would still be a living Battler no matter how you take it. Just like Ange is still Ange even though she changed her name as well. This is nothing more than the crazy rationalization of Ange's golden truth. Also, if you believe that Twilight was written by Ange herself or occurred in her head, then the red truth that Battler was dead was something she either dreamed up or wrote herself. So that doesn't make any sense either. And if it's just something that Ikiku wrote, then why would Ange even need to reconcile it? And of course we have the red statement that everyone dies and no one escapes, and the fact that the scene in which Battler escapes from the island, which he actually is never shown to actually have done, could very well be fantasy in the first place. And the final thing is that the flow of the narrative actually builds up to a fictional ending. After all, it starts with the game between Battler and Ange, in which Ange wants to know the truth, but Battler tries to get her to realize that the truth will not make her happy. It's more important to regain her respect for her family members and remember the good things about them, and then go on with her life. However, then Ange gets to read Eva's diary and learns the truth. But she cannot accept it, makes up her own truth and she kills herself. Then Ange is basically reformed, so to say, and the content of her personal blood-red truth or golden truth is revealed. The fight against Bernkastel begins and Ange has gotten to the point that she no longer cares about the real truth. She simply denies any red truth that Bernkastel throws away. Only her own golden truth is important. It's about what she wants to believe, not about what is really true. And what she wants to believe is that someone does return to her. Then Beatrice performs the obvious trick with the candy, but she agrees that it was real magic and we are led into the magic ending. Ange is back on the skyscraper, but decides not to jump. and goes on with her life. And then, years later, the impossible miracle happens that Battle does return to her and the happy ending that had been denied is shown. That to me just screams fiction. As Ryukishi said, Umineko is a bitter story. So, in the end, even though the true nature of Ange's world and perspective is ultimately unprovable, my position that it's a fictional and subjective view on a counterfactual timeline fits extremely well and actually explains why Ange's world is the way it is, rather than it being an inexplicable mystery. In essence, Ange's world serves the function of a storytelling device. What it does is allow the reader to take a new perspective on the island. After all, until Ange arrived on the scene, all we could do is look at the Rokinjima mystery from Battle's perspective, which is essentially looking at it from the present. But Ange's perspective allowed us to look back upon the mystery. And of course, Ange's perspective only started after the third game, which again is something that fits the notion that Ange's world resulted from the third game. And as I've shown in chapter 3, it actually provides us with a powerful argument for who Beatrice is. So in my view, Ange's world actually has explanatory power, both in relation to the mystery and in relation to why her world is the way it is. It resulting from the third game actually has explanatory power. Just like with Ange's world and perspective, I want to emphasize that I don't believe that it is possible to explain the nature of the meta world. I do think that we can rule out possible explanations, just like with Ange's world, but in the end it cannot be objectively established what the meta world truly is. It may be obvious that I don't believe that the meta world is metafictional, especially when you consider that Ange's world has a meta world of its own. This is going to sound very anticlimactic and I only recently arrived at this conclusion, but my position regarding the meta world is as follows. The nature and the origin of the meta world is inexplicable. So what I'm basically trying to say is that I believe that the meta world has no explanation in the first place. In essence, as soon as you get to the question of what the meta world is, you arrive at a roadblock. This is where the mystery element of Umineko truly comes to an end. So this is as far as the reader is able to go. Basically, the nature of the meta world is a matter of philosophy, not a matter of mystery solving. And I don't think that a fictional story such as Umineko truly lends itself for deep philosophical analysis to its very core, nor do I think that Ryukishi meant it to be like that. Umineko does contain philosophical elements and concepts, but I think it would be wrong to regard Ryukishi as a philosopher. Umineko does lend itself extremely well for talking about philosophical issues, especially regarding epistemology, and I've actually used Umineko scenarios as analogies to talk about epistemological issues and debating worldviews in general. It definitely suits that purpose very well, but that's in the end, I believe, a purpose that I'm superimposing upon the story. I don't believe that Ryukishi wrote it with such an intention in mind. If he did, Umineko would have turned out very different from how it in fact did turn out. Basically, the fight between naturalism versus supernaturalism ended at the end of the fourth novel. In Chiru, Battler's denial of the existence of magic becomes pretty much an irrelevant issue. It was a very important issue in the first 4 novels, but not in the last 4. Whereas Battler denied the existence of magic in general in the first 4 novels, including absolutely anything related to magic besides what was going on the island, in the 5th novel he said that he would only concentrate on the 2 days of the murders. Moreover, he allowed Natsui the right to have her own private delusions and scolded Barncastle for disturbing that delusion, using the Red Truth to demonstrate that Natsui's Beatrice was only in her head. So the element of humans versus magic basically came to an end. And in the 6th novel the true nature of magic was explained. Basically, magic is nothing more than something that you don't yet understand. Therefore, magic is only capable of doing things that are in the end possible by human means. Magic is essentially just another word for something that is unknown. Although that's a somewhat crude definition, as there are multiple forms of magic in Umineko. Magic can also be seen as a perspective on things, a sort of lens of interpretation. But in the end, there is no supernatural aspect to it at all. making it just a word or label for very natural concepts, rather than an actual supernatural concept. If you want a thorough debunking of even the possibility of a magical explanation of the meta world, I advise you to watch the final chapter of my first Umineko Explained video, in which I do give a philosophical analysis of this issue and attack the very concept of supernatural magic and why it cannot be used to explain anything at all. So, if the meta world is not the result of something supernatural, why not go for a metafictional explanation? Well, there are several reasons why that approach simply does not work. First of all, without Ange's world as a basis, the whole notion of metafiction falls apart. Because essentially the entire story would be metafictional then, with its true author never being revealed. But metafiction means fiction within fiction. So if the whole story is metafiction, it becomes a self-contradiction to speak about fiction within fiction. It would just be regular fiction. So as soon as you deny the reality of Ange's world, as I do, the whole notion of metafiction goes out of the window as a direct result. So therefore, the metafiction explanation is inherently tied to Ange's world. But it should be obvious that this leads to severe and even fatal problems. The first problem is a really severe one in my opinion. Given the inherent unreliability and the impossibility of establishing whether Ikiku even exists, and Toya Butler almost certainly being a fictional character, what actual reason is there to accept the metafiction explanation? Apart from the claim itself that is made within this unreliable perspective, there is not even the possibility of evidence in favor of the metafiction view to begin with. So what reason do we have to accept that it's true? The second problem is that even Ange's world contains a meta world. For example, Bernkastel exists in both the meta world of the games as well as in the meta world of Ange's perspective. The same applies to Fedorine, who also appears in the 8th game, and of course Ange herself appearing to the Rokkenjima characters in the 4th and 8th games. So if the meta world has a metafictional explanation, do we have to conclude that every time Ange experiences a Fedorine, Bernkastel or a similar character, that it's part of a book as well? Or is it all just in Ange's mind? But if the meta world of Ange's world has a delusion explanation, why not assume that Butler's meta world has a delusion explanation as well? And if Ange is that delusional, why can't the whole notion of these bottle ladder forgeries be part of her delusion as well? We basically get back to the inherent unreliability of Ange's perspective. You basically have to cherry pick what you want to believe, which simply is the inherent problem of believing that Ange's world is real and her perspective of it objective. Another problem is that there is a completely unbroken flow in the narrative from the first novel all the way to the last novel, which doesn't really make sense if Beatrice is the author of the first 2 novels and Ikiku and Toya Butler of the others. Especially when you consider that other forgeries exist as well. In other words, the stories are not independent stories at all, but literal sequels. Now this is more or less fine if you simply assume that Ikiku wrote her novels that way, as sequels, and that there are other forgeries that have a different format. But it becomes really problematic for Beatrice's novels. Remember that Beatrice probably threw many bottles into the sea, and only 2 of which were actually found. After all, it's pretty much by accident that they happen to have been found at all. But those 2 were also written as sequels with an unbroken flow between them. Moreover, they were also found in exact sequence. So first was the first novel found and then the second novel was found. Even though there were probably more bottles to begin with. Isn't that a bit too much of a coincidence? Also, did Beatrice write everything from Butler's perspective, including Detective's authority and such? Even though the letters were supposedly written from Maria's perspective and signed by her, although not in her handwriting. And did Beatrice in fact create the meta world, including Bernkastel, which actually is supposed to be based off Ikiku's cat? I think the only way out of this is claiming that the first 2 novels were also written by Ikiku and Toya Butler, but were based off Beatrice's bottle letters. But that creates just as many inconsistencies. First of all, how do we even know that the first 2 games represented Beatrice's letters accurately? How do we know they even really understood them in the first place? After all, the read statements about them and the facts based on Detective's authority would probably just have been made up by Ikiku and Toya Butler in the first place. So maybe they actually misunderstood Beatrice's letters in the first place and came to wrong conclusions about them. Basically, we can dig this grave of absolute unknowability, complete relativism and incoherency as deep as we want. And in the end, it becomes a battle between Battler and himself rather than between him and Beatrice. There are many more problems, of course, but it should be clear already that I'm not going to buy into the metafiction explanation. In fact, it cannot be called an explanation in the first place, since it doesn't actually explain anything. It's just another thing that adds to absolute unknowability and total relativism. But regardless of whether or not a true explanation of the meta world even exists in the first place, I do have an explanation that can make at least sense of most things, at least things that can be potentially explained. Because, for example, the existence of red truth is by definition something that is inexplicable, even by magic. So I will present to you the last piece of the puzzle in my explanation of Umineko no Nakokoro ni. This theory will explain the meta world as far as this is possible, and it will also explain what happened on Rokingema Prime. But again, I want you all to keep in mind that I do not claim that I can prove this final theory, only that it is a way to make sense of the story in regards to these two aspects. And these are the three main aspects of this theory. The second game is Rokingema Prime. Most of the story is rooted in Battler's experience in a near-death state. And there is a fifth perspective, namely the reader's perspective. So here's what could have happened. Rosa made several plans for carrying out her ceremony. She wrote them all down and put them into bottles. Not in the sense of an entire novel, and especially not from Battler's perspective. After carrying out one of those plans, she would throw them all into the sea to create a cat box. The plan that was actually carried out was what we have come to know as the second game. Rosa achieved a perfect victory. Not only did she succeed in her ceremony, but she was acknowledged by the man whom she wanted to be acknowledged by. Battler was brought to his knees and wished for the witch to show herself. Rosa used the ladder in the parlor to separate from Battler to make the preparations for Battler's surrender to her as the witch Beatrice. She had Genji bring the drunken Battler to Kin's study where she was in her Beatrice outfit, ready to accept Battler's surrender. And, as promised, if Battler would acknowledge her, all mysteries would be explained. So in the final half hour before the bomb blast, Rosa laid her heart bare to Battler, as we were shown in that magic scene in the study. Beatrice would answer any question Battler had. This included her explanation of other plans she had to carry out the murders. So this was the moment where Battler learned the truth from the culprit herself. Then one of two things happened. Either they were caught up in the bomb blast, or Battler was allowed to escape via the secret tunnel. You could argue that Rosa went along with him, or that Battler was alone, only accompanied by the delusion of the witch Beatrice, the latter of which seems far more likely to me. Now I think a case could be made for both the option that Battler was caught in the explosion, but probably within the tunnel itself, or at least not within the full force of the explosion. Or that Battler actually made it through the secret tunnel and drowned when jumping off the boat, trying to catch the delusion of Beatrice as shown near the end of the 8th novel. Of course, that scene could be symbolic as well. But whichever be the case, the point is that Battler knew the truth and died a slow death while being unconscious in a state of near death. I think that neither case is implausible, and I could also very much imagine how Rosa would eventually choose to let Battler go after her victory, even though she needs to kill everyone for a ritual. I think she would basically have been at peace and would allow fate to decide whether Battler would make it or not, as he would have had extremely little time left to escape. So Rosa allowing Battler to leave in a situation in which the chances of survival would be really small does fit the Beatrice character quite well, leaving things to fate. So whether or not the drowning scene is symbolic or a somewhat accurate depiction of what happened to Battler is in the end not overly relevant, because in both cases its symbolism is what matters. But essentially what is shown is that Beatrice, actually depicted as the witch Beatrice, suddenly disappears beneath the waves and Battler goes after her and eventually has to leave her behind. If we take the second approach, that this is a somewhat accurate depiction of what happened to Battler, we could imagine that at the time that he was forced to move back to the surface he was already out of breath. So he washed up on the beach alive but barely due to severe brain damage due to lack of oxygen, and eventually after a relatively long but undetermined time passed away there. So what is the meta world in the games? It's Battler's delusional experience within his own mind while being in a state of near death. Just like people can have very vivid hallucinations during a near-death experience, Battler's mind tried to make sense of what happened to him. When you dream, your own mind creates all the content of the dream from information you already have available in your mind. Nevertheless, when you walk down the street in your dream, for example, even though it's all generated by your own mind, you still may very well not be consciously aware of what is around the next corner. And that's precisely the case with Battler as well. Even though the information is contained in his mind, that doesn't mean that he is consciously aware of it. Basically, the games are a trip through Battler's mind in which he is, so to say, rediscovering Beatrice's revelation and trying to understand it. This is how it becomes a fight between Battler and Beatrice, a fight between human tricks and magic. And this could be what is symbolized by the two battlers during the drowning scene. The real battler has to let go of Beatrice and drifts towards the surface. Nevertheless, a second battler, namely Meta Battler, then grabs Beatrice's hands, embraces her and becomes one with her, and they drift towards the symbolic cat box on the bottom of the ocean floor, adorned by the symbolic golden rose. By the way, just on a side note, there is a lot of rose symbolism in Umineko. We have this golden rose, Beatrice wearing a rose in her hair, the former Beatrice Virgilia having roses on her head. We have Maria's rose that was important since the very beginning. Runaway's blood turns into rose petals. Could this have been another hint pointing towards Rosa? Just a thought. Now when it comes to this issue of the meta world and the games being Battler's experience rooted in hallucinations while being in a state of near death, it logically follows that Battler has to die at some point. At the very least, this would have to happen before Brancaster makes the red proclamation that Battler is dead. So at what point in time did Battler's experience come to an end because of death? And of course, the obvious question that follows from that, why does the story not come to an end when Battler dies? Why do we still see a Meta Battler? Well, when it comes to the moment that Battler dies, I think it's extremely difficult to point to a specific moment, but I think there are three general time frames that are the most plausible candidates for Battler's death. Now I do sort of have a preference for the first of the three possibilities, but nevertheless I don't have a definite stance on this issue. Moreover, a case could be made for all three possibilities, and of course they may all be incorrect. In fact, as I've said before, we are not dealing anymore with issues that can be proven anyway. But these three possibilities would be at the end of the 6th game, the end of the 5th game, or the end of the 4th game. Let's examine these possibilities a bit. Why do I think that these three time frames are the most plausible candidates for Battler's death? Well, basically, if Battler dies at some point, then we would expect to see a change in the Meta Battler character. After all, Meta Battler would have to be the real Battler prior to death and would essentially be a fictional character after death. Another thing is that it is stated that Battler didn't make it in time for Beatrice's funeral, and this is one of the reasons that the role of the investigator in the 7th novel is fulfilled by Will. Also, the change in Battler's character is most dramatic in the final novel. So I suspect that Battler died before the 7th novel began. Why would the end of the 6th novel be a good candidate? 1. Battler does in the end get to understand Beatrice despite the issue of not making it in time for her funeral, which could also mean that he only truly comprehended her after she already died. 2. The novel that comes directly after it has no observer at all, and Battler's role is filled in by Will, who is a fictional character. So why would the near end of the 5th novel be a good candidate? 1. Battler at least symbolically died just before figuring out the truth, and the same goes for Beatrice. 2. Battler changes from a human into a magical being and becomes Game Master. And 3. The whole notion of the games just being actual novels within the story itself began at the beginning of the 6th novel. And finally, why would the end of the 4th novel be a good candidate? Well, Beatrice quote-unquote died and the 5th game got a new Game Master, and Battler initially doesn't even take part of this game. Battler changes his focus from anti-magic to trying to understand Beatrice. Beatrice's who am I question actually implies Battler's death. Quote, "You shear me a Battler, I will now kill you. And right now, there is no one other than you on this island. The only one alive on this island is you. Nothing outside the island can interfere. You are all alone on this island, and of course I am not you, yet I am here now and will kill you." Battler shouldn't have known about Erica's corpse, although one might argue that her corpse was found on October 3rd and Rosa told Battler about that. And the final point, Umineko is divided into two parts, Umineko no Nakakoro ni and Umineko no Nakakoro ni Chiru. It might be the case that these two parts tell different sides to the story. I do want to emphasize again that we are at this point beyond the things that can actually be proven, so this is just food for thought. I won't say that much more about it. So why are the games the way they are? What is the difference between them and what kind of plan does each of them represent? This is how I see the games. The first game, Beatrice's incomplete victory. Rosa gets to complete her ceremony, but she fails to bring Battler to his knees, so there is no acknowledgement from Battler. The second game is Beatrice's complete victory. Rosa actually gets Battler to acknowledge that she's a witch and surrenders, and in exchange Battler gets the truth revealed to him. In the third game, Beatrice loses. The epitaph is solved and Beatrice is killed by George, so from that moment on the game is completely out of her hands. The fourth game is Rosa's backup plan. Rosa wins but has to use a backup plan due to the family members figuring out that Kinzo is already dead, disrupting her original closed room scenarios, and decides therefore to take the family members hostage and tries to make Battler believe in magic through their testimony. The fifth game is George's backup plan. The epitaph is solved before the first twilight, which results in George taking over the game using his own backup plan. In the sixth game, Rosa and George's plan is completely disrupted by Erica. Battler convinces the family to join in pulling a prank on Erica, disrupting Rosa's and George's murder scheme, and which eventually results in Rosa's death. The seventh game is a hypothetical what-if scenario. A hypothetical scenario in which the murders are not carried out by any of the two culprits. And finally, the eighth game is a depiction of a belief that existed in Ange's world. And I'm referring here to Bernkastel's game, of course. But then there is one oddity left, namely if Battler dies at some point and Ange isn't always present, and she herself dies as well, who is the observer in that case? After all, if Ange killed herself and the ending is a depiction of her golden truth, then who is actually observing that? Moreover, who is the observer in the seventh novel, since neither Battler nor Ange is present there? Furthermore, there are many scenes in the first couple of novels where Meta Battler isn't present either. There is a great multitude of scenes that neither Island Battler nor Meta Battler experiences. Think about the Tea Party scenes where only Beatrice, Bernkastel and Lambda Delta are present. So that's kind of strange, isn't it? How can you have no observer present, yet those scenes being depicted? Well, here I have another theory, and that's the theory that there is a fifth perspective. The first perspective would be the detective's perspective, or the objective perspective, which in the first four novels is Island Battler's perspective, and in the fifth novel, of course, is Erica's perspective. The second perspective is Meta Battler's perspective. The third perspective is the subjective or magical perspective, namely the scenes on the island in which Island Battler is not present. And the fourth perspective is Ange's perspective. And I believe there to be actually a fifth perspective, namely your perspective. In other words, the reader's perspective. In other words, the first four perspectives are included in the fifth, and one could argue that the third perspective and the fifth could be seen as the same perspective. But the point is that you, the reader himself, is viewing the world of Umineko as a passive participant, so to say, from an even higher world than the meta world, so to say. So why do I think that this perspective exists? Well, for two reasons basically. First, of course, that there are scenes that neither Battler nor Ange observes. And the second one is that it is heavily implied that such a perspective exists. Remember in the first novel, or in episode 5 of the anime version, we see the first appearance of Bernkastel. Then, when Beatrice leaves, Bernkastel talks to someone who is not depicted. Now, who is she talking to here? It doesn't seem to be Battler. Bernkastel is basically talking to someone about the rules of the game, or better said, provides you with hints on how to understand or figure out the rules. My theory is that Bernkastel is actually talking to you, in other words, to the readers of the story themselves. Moreover, there is also talk about the so-called theater-going witches, which seems to be referring to the actual readers as well. In fact, at the end of the seventh novel, when Bernkastel proclaims that she is the game master of the final game board and promises that it will be a horrible and brutal story, and is about to proclaim something in red, Lambda Delta comes in and says that she may not want to do that since there might still be some witches with naive dreams. Then Bernkastel says, I make this promise to you, this game will not have a happy ending. So who is Lambda Delta talking about when she talks about these witches, and who is Bernkastel addressing when she says, I will make this promise to you? My theory is that this is also a case where the readers themselves are addressed. They are these theater-going witches. In other words, you, the reader, are treated like an invisible character within the actual story itself, which makes you an actual participant. Not in the sense of influencing the story itself, but you are a player with the task of figuring out the truth. So the actual observer, who is present during all the scenes where neither Battler nor Ange is present or still alive, is you yourself. This fifth perspective is in fact most obvious in the seventh novel, because when you think about it, who is the observer in the seventh novel? Battler isn't present, Ange isn't reading it, and Will is a fictional character and so is Leon. So who is the observer? Moreover, where does the information in the seventh novel come from? From a metafiction perspective, Battler wouldn't know about Yasu's history in the first place, and therefore Ikiku cannot know about it either. Unless, of course, if you believe that Ikiku is Yasu, which is in fact a theory that some people believe in, meaning that there were actually 3 survivors of the Rokkenjima incident, Eva, Battler and Shannon. And then somehow Shannon turned into Ikiku the mystery rider, which at least explains this aspect, but in turn creates more problems than it solves. Basically, my fifth perspective theory implies that Umineko should be thought of not so much as a regular novel, but more like a computer game, in which you are not merely a reader but a player instead. And Ryukishi himself is an actual player as well, or better said, the final boss in the game. At least that's my theory, and this fits extremely well with the whole premise of my video, that Ryukishi has put himself into the story as an invisible character, who acts like the final boss of the game, so to say, protecting the real truth and putting up a veil of a false explanation. And as I said before, I believe that Ikiku Hachiyo is Ryukishi's representation, or his game piece acting on his behalf. You know, I think that most people actually expected a delusion explanation to the meta world, as the first meta scene actually starts like a sort of dream. They are all sitting in the parlor and talking about their deaths as if it's the most normal thing ever. In the manga version, however, Battler actually wakes up there and at first doesn't understand what is going on. And another interesting thing about the manga version, by the way, is that it mentions the resurrection of lost love. So how George got Shannon back, how Jessica got Cannon back, and how Maria got her mother back. Which explains why Shannon and Cannon are suddenly present among the others, but Rosa is not present. So why didn't Maria get her mother back? Well, not only Shannon and Cannon are added to the group of Maria, George, Jessica and Battler, but Beatrice herself shows up as well. Again, that's just a thought, as you could of course also interpret it as meaning that Shannon and Cannon were actually alive at the end of the game. Which is how believers in the official explanation would probably interpret it. And that's it. I'm finished. That's my explanation of Umineko no Nakakoroni. So, is my explanation correct? Well, obviously I believe it is, but I don't know. The only person who knows that is Ryukishi himself. He is the only person who is truly in the position to know the truth. Unless he states it in red, we can only put forth theories. We cannot create our own red truths about the story. So what if I'm wrong? Well, in that case, I think I've still constructed a workable and coherent alternative explanation. And there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think Ryukishi would really appreciate that, since what he seems to enjoy most of all are all the ideas and theorizing about the story by fans. I'm in the process of writing a mystery novel myself, and if someone would come up with a vastly different explanation than the one I actually intended, yet it still fits all the evidence and is coherent and plausible, I would be really excited and still consider that a valid solution to the story, even though I never intended it as the actual solution. I would definitely appreciate such an alternative explanation. So what if I'm right? In that case, I did succeed in exposing the deception, but did I reach the actual hidden truth? I'm probably not correct about absolutely everything in the first place, and I might have missed several clues both in favor of my explanation as well as against certain details of it. Moreover, as thorough as my explanation is, there are still things that I haven't addressed or can't completely explain. Which is of course to be expected, and I could probably update my theory with even more clues if I would reread the entire story, but that's a bit too much work of course. But it's inevitable that there are certain holes in any explanation I could come up with. Moreover, there are things that simply cannot be explained in principle. For example, red truth can't exist. Neither my explanation of the meta world nor even magic could ever account for absolute knowledge of things that cannot be known with absolute certainty. In other words, the existence of red truth is logically impossible and therefore cannot be explained. It should be regarded as a rule of the story and not something that has an explanation within the story itself. After all, if Ryukishi or any other author for that matter wants to put in absolute certainties such as red truths, then they inevitably doom themselves into not being able to rationally explain it within the story itself. Therefore, I don't think it should be viewed as something that either has or can have an explanation. It's just a rule within a fictional story. Just like it's pointless to try to go against the rules of a board game. And if I'm right, when will Ryukishi reveal that the official explanation was a deception? Well, I don't know, and I don't expect it to happen anytime soon, especially when you consider that he already started on a new project, and since Umineko still is being purchased a lot, and there is still much discussion about it. I at least hope that he won't wait for the 10th year anniversary of Umineko to bring out a final episode like he did with Higurashi. It would kind of suck if the hidden truth remains hidden for 10 years. I guess that if my theory is correct, what would speed up this process is if the theory that the official explanation is a deception becomes more prevalent among the Umineko fanbase. But given how much hate I get from even the very suggestion of the possibility that the official explanation might be a deception, I think that there's a very thick barrier that needs to be broken in order for this theory to become something that is at least accepted within the Umineko fanbase as a genuine possibility. It is definitely not something that I can do by myself. But what would actually be a catchy name for this theory, by the way? The official explanation is called the Shikanen Freeze explanation, so what would be a cool name for my theory? Maybe one of my viewers can come up with a nice name. So is this the absolute final video? Or will there be an addendum in which I respond to criticism? Probably yes, but not anytime soon. Actually, most parts of my explanation have gone virtually unchallenged to begin with, so there is actually surprisingly little to respond to. What I would like to do is make a critique of the everyone is lying or black battler theory to the 5th game, which seems to be the most accepted explanation of the 5th game. However, there are some major flaws in that theory, and also I could actually use that same idea and apply it to my own theory, and it would actually solve many of those flaws. So my own version of the everyone is lying theory would in fact be superior to the black battler theory in my opinion. But anyway, I don't think there is any need for such a strange explanation to begin with. Some other things I would like to talk about in a potential addendum is even more criticism of the Shikanen theory, because that never ends, and regarding some of the inherent flaws I see people making when defending the Shikanen theory. And I would also like to list the different problems each version of the Shikanen theory runs into, as there are actually several quite distinct versions of it. Also, I could spend some time dealing with some very minor counter-arguments to my logic error explanation. But to be honest, those are extremely weak and easy to refute to the point that they are hardly worth mentioning at all. In fact, they can hardly be called arguments, they are actually more like opinions. Actually, I think that the major criticism to my theory as a whole is just a general emotional objection to my theory as a whole. One of which is that I'm basically the only person who adheres to this theory. Which is actually not really true, as a great majority of the individual aspects of my theory are very much present among the fanbase or have been present. Also, there are lots and lots of people who object to the Shikanen theory, the notion of character depth and the absurd and incoherent wordplay required to get around the red in the first twilight of the 3rd game, for example. But most of those people come to the conclusion that the Shikanen theory is so problematic because Ryukishi basically just fucked up. Which is in and of itself not a problem, but I obviously don't believe that that's the case. Especially considering that a workable alternate explanation exists, and the fact that there were actual hints pointing towards deception. But what it comes down to is that many individual aspects of my theory can in fact be found on the internet. I'm actually not the first one in many things I have said in this video. But even so, this video is certainly in the spirit of Umineko, so to say. After all, wasn't Battle the only one who opposed the magic explanation and refused to go along with the theory that everything was done by an actual witch? Wasn't Battle the only one who was willing to go against Erika's accusation of Natsui in the 5th game? Wasn't he alone in believing that she was innocent? Didn't Beatrice say in our confession that her story was only meant for the 1 in 1,000? So in that sense, I don't really feel uncomfortable going against the majority. So at the very end, let's turn back to the main premise of my video. The official explanation as the real truth versus the official explanation as a purposeful deception. I said in the introduction that you will basically have to make a choice. Either the official explanation is indeed a deception on Ryukashi's part, or it's essentially a matter of bad writing. Meaning that Ryukashi meant it to be the truth, but he just made lots of mistakes and screwed up the internal consistency of his story. I think I made a very strong case for this premise, and debating people in the comment section has absolutely affirmed that second point. If the official explanation is indeed the actual truth, then it's in the end like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, which in the end can be done with enough creativity, but leaves us with a truth that is actually not really worth defending at all. After all, the main thing that most of the believers in the official explanation have shown me, despite their love for the story and despite their sincerity and hard efforts, so this is not a personal attack at all, but they have shown me precisely what I said in the first part. The official explanation can only be defended by taking its truth as an unshakable starting position and then interpret everything in light of that starting position. In other words, to force everything to fit the Shikanon Freeze explanation, rather than have it as the conclusion of the actual evidence found in the story. In fact, when I listened to the rationalizations for the inconsistencies of the official explanation, especially the Shikanon theory, I realized that if those rationalizations are indeed necessary to defend the Shikanon theory, then almost all Shikanon believers actually initially came to believe that Shannon and Canon were the same person on the basis of faulty assumptions and wrong arguments, that only later were altered to make it more consistent with that belief. But there are of course also people who agree with me that the official explanation is incoherent, but simply believe that Ryukashi screwed up his story. However, I did not only argue against the official explanation, I also demonstrated that an alternative explanation exists, and that there were actually hints pointing towards deception as I showed in chapter 9. So when you take that into account, the Ryukashi screwed up theory becomes less plausible, as it would be a little bit too much of a coincidence that there just happens to exist an alternative explanation and hints pointing towards deception, all just by accident. It's possible of course, but it's not very likely I think. So if the official explanation being true is extremely implausible, and if it all being the result of mistakes is rather implausible as well, then perhaps the deception theory wasn't such a crazy idea after all. At the very least, I think I made a very strong defense for that position. Despite all the hate I get for even proposing this theory, I think that it's a position that definitely deserves to exist among all the theories surrounding Umineko no Nakokoro ni. So now I am at the end of this very long analysis. All that's left for me is to express my thanks to Ryukashi and all the folks of 7th Expansion. And of course the people who made the translations. Thank you so much for such a brilliant and epic story. It should be clear that I thoroughly enjoyed it and I consider Umineko one of the best stories I've ever heard of. So thank you so much Ryukashi for such a fantastic experience. It definitely was quite a ride. Now I want to end this video with a little magic of my own. Please don't take this too seriously, it's sort of a joke. But when I was going through the anime episodes on YouTube looking for specific scenes, you tend to press at random locations in the time bar, which, if the video isn't playing, will result in a still frame that is located at that specific moment. And when I was going through the 10th episode, I randomly got a specific still frame that really made me smile. Especially because I got it at random. So let's consider that my little miracle of magic. Thanks for watching.
Bye.